The millionaire walked into the restaurant as always. But when he heard the waitress speaking 9 different languages, something inside him broke. Everyone stopped, shocked, when he stood up and did something unthinkable. No one would ever forget what happened that day. The crystal chandeliers of the Golden Pearl cast dancing shadows across the mahogany walls, their light reflecting off polished silverware and the carefully composed faces of Chicago's elite. John Thorne sat at the head of the corner table, his steel-gray eyes scanning the room with the practiced detachment of a man who'd learned long ago that showing weakness was a luxury he couldn't afford. "The European markets are showing unprecedented volatility," murmured Heinrich Krueger, the German investor seated to John's right. His accent was thick, but his English precise. "We need assurance that your portfolio can weather another downturn." John nodded, half listening. At 55, he'd heard variations of this conversation 1,000 times. Money talked, but it rarely said anything new. His fingers drummed silently against the white tablecloth as he prepared his standard response about diversified investments and risk management. That's when she approached their table. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to the Golden Pearl." Her voice carried a warmth that seemed to cut through the restaurant's refined atmosphere like sunlight through stained glass. "I'm Sophie, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." John looked up, and something deep in his chest shifted, a sensation he hadn't felt in decades. The young woman standing beside their table couldn't have been more than 25, with auburn hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, and eyes the color of autumn leaves. But it wasn't her beauty that made his breath catch. It was something else, something that whispered at the edges of his memory like a half-remembered dream. "Bonsoir," replied François Dubois, the French investor, switching to his native tongue with a slight smile. "Comment allez-vous ce soir?" Without missing a beat, Sophie responded in flawless French, her pronunciation so natural it could have been her mother tongue. "Très bien. Merci. Puis-je vous recommander notre spécialité de ce soir?" Krueger raised an eyebrow, impressed. "Sprechen Sie auch Deutsch?" he asked, testing her. "Natürlich," Sophie replied with a gentle laugh. "I'd be happy to explain our wine selection in German if you'd prefer." John found himself leaning forward, mesmerized, as the conversation flowed seamlessly between languages: French, German, Spanish, and back to English. He studied her face, searching for something he couldn't quite name. The way she tilted her head when she laughed, the graceful movement of her hands as she spoke, the slight dimple that appeared when she smiled. "Remarkable," Dubois commented after Sophie had taken their orders and moved to another table. "Where do they find staff like that? Such poise, such education." "Indeed," Krueger agreed. "Most impressive for someone so young." John said nothing. His gaze followed Sophie as she moved through the dining room, switching effortlessly between languages as she served tables of international clientele: Italian with the Milanese couple by the window, Portuguese with the Brazilian businessmen near the bar. Each transition was seamless, natural, as if she'd been born speaking all of them. But it was more than her linguistic abilities that captivated him. There was something in her posture, the way she carried herself with quiet dignity, despite her humble position, something that reached across the years and grabbed him by the throat. 25 years. The thought hit him like a physical blow. 25 years since he'd made the most cowardly decision of his life. 25 years since he'd walked away from the seat, Joseph of the Blossoms orphanage, leaving behind a piece of his soul wrapped in a pink blanket. John, are you quite all right?" Krueger's voice seemed to come from very far away. John blinked, realizing he'd been staring at his untouched wine glass, lost in memories he'd spent decades trying to bury. "Of course, my apologies, gentlemen. You were saying about the quarterly projections." But even as he forced himself back into the conversation, part of his mind remained elsewhere. Traveling back to a time when he'd been young and foolish and desperately in love with a girl his family would never accept. Olivia. Her name still had the power to stop his heart. Olivia Martinez, with her dancing eyes and infectious laugh, who'd cleaned offices at his father's company to pay for night school. Olivia, who'd dreamed of becoming a teacher and had seen something good in the spoiled, rich boy who'd fallen head over heels for her warmth and authenticity. The pregnancy had been unplanned, but not unwelcome. At least not to them. They'd made whispered plans in stolen moments, talking about running away together. Starting fresh somewhere, His family's money and influence couldn't reach them, but John had been 22 and still dependent on his father's empire, still weak enough to be swayed by threats and ultimatums. "She's a gold digger," his father had snarled during their final confrontation. "Can't you see? She's trapped you with this pregnancy. Give her money if you must, but don't throw your life away on some cleaning girl's bastard." The words had been like acid in his veins, but the threats that followed had been worse. His father would cut him off completely, destroy Olivia's reputation, make sure she never worked in Chicago again. The family's lawyers could make problems disappear, his father had reminded him, even problems involving unwanted pregnancies. So John had taken the coward's way out. He'd convinced himself he was protecting Olivia and their unborn child by walking away. He'd left money, a substantial trust fund, with instructions that it should go to the child when she came of age. He'd insisted the baby girl be placed at St. Joseph's, one of the better orphanages in the city. He'd even left something personal, a small silver medallion that had belonged to his grandmother, asking that it be given to the child as a keepsake. Then he'd gotten on a plane to Europe and spent 2 years trying to drink away the memory of Olivia's tears. "Excuse me, sir." John startled back to the present. Sophie stood beside their table again, her professional smile in place. "I noticed you haven't touched your wine. Would you prefer something else?" Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. Not to Olivia, though there were echoes of her in the shape of Sophie's eyes, but to his own mother, the same stubborn chin, the same way of holding her shoulders when she was trying to appear confident. "The wine is fine," he managed, his voice rougher than intended. "I was just lost in thought. Of course, is there anything else I can get for you gentlemen?" "Actually," John said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them, "I'm curious about your background. Your language skills are extraordinary." A shadow crossed Sophie's face. So brief he almost missed it. "Thank you. I've always been drawn to languages, I think. I think they help you understand people better, connect with them regardless of where they come from." "Where did you study?" "Here and there," she replied, her smile becoming more guarded. "Mostly self-taught, actually. Books, online courses, practice with customers. The Golden Pearl attracts a very international clientele." "Self-taught," Dubois interjected. "Impossible. Your pronunciation is far too perfect." Sophie's laugh was soft, but there was something wistful about it. "When you have the right motivation, you'd be surprised what you can accomplish." Before John could ask what she meant, she was called away to another table. He watched her go, his mind racing. Self-taught, extraordinary dedication, and that age, 25. Exactly the right age. Fascinating young woman, Krueger observed, though I detect a certain sadness about her. Perhaps a difficult past. John's hand moved unconsciously to his jacket pocket, where he'd carried the same small object for 25 years, his grandmother's silver medallion, the twin to the one he'd left at the orphanage. His fingers traced its familiar shape through the fabric. It couldn't be, but even as he tried to dismiss the thought, it took root and began to grow. The age was right, the location was right, and something about her, something indefinable but unmistakable, called to a part of him that had been silent for decades as the evening wore on and business was concluded. John found himself unable to concentrate on anything but the young woman moving gracefully between tables. Every gesture, every smile, every tilt of her head seemed to whisper possibilities he'd never dared to imagine. When the investors finally departed and John was left alone with his thoughts, Sophie approached one last time with the check. "I hope everything was satisfactory this evening, Mr. Thorne." She knew his name. Of course she would. He was a regular, and the Golden Pearl prided itself on personal service, but hearing it from her lips sent an unexpected jolt through him. "Very satisfactory," he replied, leaving a tip that was generous even by his standards. "Sophie, that's a beautiful name. Does it have special meaning?" She paused in collecting the dishes. "It means wisdom, I'm told, though I'm not sure I've lived up to it." "I think you underestimate yourself." Their eyes met for a moment, and John felt something pass between them. Recognition, perhaps, or at least curiosity. Then Sophie looked away, professional distance reasserting itself. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. We hope to see you again soon." As John walked out into the Chicago night, the medallion seemed to burn against his chest. For 25 years, He'd carried his guilt and regret like stones in his heart. For 25 years, he'd wondered about the daughter he'd never known, the child he'd abandoned in a moment of weakness. Now, for the first time in decades, he dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, the past wasn't as irretrievably lost as he'd believed. John didn't sleep that night. He lay in his penthouse bedroom, staring at the city lights bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows, while his mind churned with possibilities he'd thought buried forever. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sophie's face, the way she'd tilted her head when she laughed, the graceful movement of her hands, the fleeting sadness that had crossed her features when she'd mentioned her background. By dawn, he'd made his decision. The Golden Pearl didn't open for lunch service until 11, but John arrived at 10:30, pacing the sidewalk like a man possessed. When the maitre d' finally unlocked the doors, John was the first customer inside. "Mr. Thorne," the man said with surprise. "You're quite early today. Your usual table. Actually, I was hoping to speak with one of your servers, Sophie. I believe her name was. Is she working today?" The maitre d's eyebrows rose slightly. "Miss Collins, yes, she's here. Setting up for the lunch service, is there? A problem with her service yesterday evening?" "Quite the opposite," John replied quickly. "I was impressed by her professionalism. I'd like to compliment her personally." Within minutes, Sophie appeared from the kitchen, looking surprised to see him. In the afternoon light streaming through the restaurant's tall windows, she looked younger, more vulnerable somehow. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the same black uniform as the other servers, but there was an elegance about her that couldn't be disguised. "Mr. Thorne, I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," he assured her. "I was wondering if you might have a few minutes to talk. Perhaps over coffee." Sophie glanced around the empty restaurant, clearly uncertain. "I'm supposed to be setting up tables, but I suppose I could take a short break. Would you like to sit at the bar?" They settled on adjacent bar stools, and John ordered 2 coffees from the bartender who was polishing glasses with practiced efficiency. For a moment, neither of them spoke. John found himself studying her profile, searching for familiar features while trying not to seem creepy. "You mentioned last night that you're mostly self-taught with languages," he began carefully. "That's remarkable. What inspired you to learn so many?" Sophie wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, as if drawing warmth from it. "I guess you could say I've always been searching for something or someone." She paused, seeming to weigh her words. "I grew up in an orphanage here in Chicago, St. Joseph of the Blossoms. Maybe you've heard of it." John's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. "St. Joseph's," he repeated, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Yes, I know of it, good reputation. The sisters there were wonderful," Sophie continued, unaware of the earthquake her words had triggered in John's chest. "Sister Margaret especially. She noticed I had an ear for languages when I was about 10. I'd picked up some Spanish from the kitchen staff, and she encouraged me to keep learning. 10 years old," John murmured. "That's quite young to show such aptitude." Sophie's smile was wistful. "Sister Margaret used to say that maybe I was meant to be a bridge between worlds. She said learning languages was my way of reaching out, trying to find where I belonged." Her fingers moved unconsciously to her throat, where a thin silver chain disappeared beneath her uniform. "She said that someday, speaking all those languages might help me connect with my past." John's breath caught. "Your past? I know it sounds silly," Sophie said with a self-conscious laugh, "but I've always had this feeling that there are clues out there about where I came from. The orphanage has some records, but they're incomplete. Sister Margaret showed me a file once. There were notes suggesting my birth parents might have had international connections. It wasn't much to go on, but it gave me hope. And that's why you learned languages. That's part of it. I figured if I could speak to people from all over the world, maybe someday I'd meet someone who knew something about my family. Maybe I'd recognize a story, or a name, or..." She trailed off, looking embarrassed. "I know it's a long shot, but hope is what keeps you going, you know." John set down his coffee cup with hands that he hoped weren't visibly shaking. "What else do you know about your background? Any personal items, perhaps?" Sophie's hand moved to her throat again, this time pulling out the silver chain. At the end dangled a small medallion, tarnished with age but clearly well cared for. "Just this," Sister Margaret said it came with me when I was brought to the orphanage. It's not much, but it's the only connection I have to whoever I was before. John's vision blurred. He gripped the edge of the bar to steady himself, as 25 years of carefully constructed walls came crashing down around him. The medallion was identical to the one burning in his jacket pocket, down to the intricate engraving of a pearl surrounded by delicate filigree. "Mr. Thorne, are you okay? You look pale." Sophie's voice seemed to come from very far away. John forced himself to breathe, to think, to not collapse under the weight of recognition and regret, an impossible, terrifying hope. "I'm fine," he managed. "The medallion is beautiful, quite unusual, isn't it? I've never seen another one like it. I used to make up stories about it when I was little. Maybe it belonged to a princess, or a traveler from a distant land. Silly childhood fantasies." She tucked it back beneath her uniform. "Sister Margaret always said it must have been precious to whoever gave it to me. Because it's real silver. Someone who loved me wanted me to have it. Someone who loved you." The words hit John like physical blows. He had loved her. This remarkable young woman who'd been a tiny, perfect baby the last time he'd seen her. He'd loved her enough to break his own heart rather than subject her to his family's cruelty. He'd loved her enough to walk away. But looking at Sophie now, seeing her strength, her grace, her determination to find her place in the world despite having no family to guide her, John wondered if love had been enough, if his grand gesture of sacrifice had been nothing more than cowardice dressed up in noble intentions. "Mr. Thorne," Sophie was studying his face with concern, "you really don't look well. Should I call someone?" "No, John struggled to regain his composure. "I'm sorry. You just remind me of someone I used to know. Someone important. Someone from your past. Yes, someone I lost a long time ago." Sophie's expression softened with sympathy. "I'm sorry. That must be painful. It was my own fault," John said quietly. "I made choices that seemed right at the time. But looking back," he shook his head, "do you ever wonder if the people who gave you up had good reasons? If maybe they thought they were protecting you?" Sophie was quiet for a long moment, absently tracing patterns on the bar with her finger. "I used to be angry," she finally said. "When I was a teenager, I'd lie awake at night, wondering how anyone could just give away their child. But Sister Margaret helped me understand that sometimes people make impossible choices for reasons we can't see. And now I think that whoever my parents were, they must have loved me enough to make sure I ended up somewhere safe. Saint Joseph's isn't perfect, but the sisters gave me a good life. They made sure I got an education, that I had opportunities. Maybe my birth parents knew that was more than they could give me." John felt tears threatening for the first time in decades. "You're very wise. I try to be. Holding on to anger doesn't help anyone. And I learned a long time ago that I couldn't let my past define my future. I have to create my own family now, my own sense of belonging. And working here, this is part of that." Sophie glanced around the elegant restaurant. "It's not where I plan to stay forever, but it's teaching me things. About people, about the world. And the money is helping me save for college. I want to study international relations. Maybe work for an embassy someday. Use these languages for something meaningful." Pride swelled in John's chest. Pride he had no right to feel, but felt nonetheless. This remarkable young woman had faced abandonment and uncertainty with grace and determination. She'd turned her search for identity into a mission to connect with others. She was everything he could have hoped for in a daughter, and more than he deserved. "That sounds like a wonderful goal," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "I'm sure you'll achieve it." Sophie smiled, and for a moment, the resemblance to his mother was so strong it took his breath away. "Thank you. I should probably get back to work now. The lunch crowd will be arriving soon." As she started to stand, John reached out impulsively. "Sophie, wait. Would you be willing to have dinner with me sometime? Not here, somewhere else? I'd like to hear more about your plans, maybe offer some advice. I have connections in the international business community that might be helpful." Sophie hesitated, clearly weighing the offer. "That's very kind, but I don't really know you, Mr. Thorne. You seem nice enough. But, of course, I understand completely." John pulled out a business card and wrote his personal number on the back. "Take this. Think about it. If you change your mind, call me. No pressure." Sophie accepted the card, studying it with curious eyes. John Thorne Industries. I've heard of your company. You're quite successful. Success is relative, John said quietly. Some of the most important things in life can't be measured in dollars. As Sophie returned to her work and John prepared to leave, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror behind the bar. For the first time in years, there was something other than emptiness in his eyes. There was hope. Walking out into the Chicago afternoon, John pulled his grandmother's medallion from his pocket and held it up to the light. The silver caught the sun, throwing tiny rainbows across his palm. After 25 years of carrying this reminder of his greatest failure, it might finally have the chance to become something else entirely. A bridge back to the daughter he'd never stopped loving. 3 days passed before Sophie called. John had spent those 72 hours in a state of restless anticipation, checking his phone obsessively and finding excuses to drive past the Golden Pearl. He'd even considered having his assistant make a reservation, but something told him that would be pushing too hard. Sophie needed to come to him willingly, or not at all. When his phone finally rang on Thursday evening, he nearly dropped it in his haste to answer. "Mr. Thorne, this is Sophie Collins." From the restaurant. "Sophie." Her name came out as barely more than a whisper. "I was hoping you'd call. I've been thinking about your offer. Dinner, I mean, and the advice about international relations." She paused, and he could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "Would Saturday work for you?" Saturday would be perfect. They arranged to meet at Romano's, a quiet Italian place in Lincoln Park that John chose specifically because it wasn't part of the high society circuit where he might be recognized. The last thing he wanted was gossip, complicating an already delicate situation. Saturday arrived with an unseasonably warm breeze that carried the scent of Lake Michigan through the city streets. John arrived 15 minutes early and claimed a corner table, his palms embarrassingly damp as he waited. When Sophie walked through the door, he felt his breath catch all over again. She'd traded her server's uniform for a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, and her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders. She looked young and pretty and nervous, and John had to resist the urge to stand up and pull out her chair, like the gentleman his mother had raised him to be. Too formal, he reminded himself. Too much like a father. "Thank you for this," Sophie said as she settled across from him. "I have to admit, I'm a little starstruck. I looked up your company online. You're quite impressive, Mr. Thorne." "John, please. And I think you're the impressive one. Tell me more about how you ended up at St. Joseph's." Sophie's fingers found the stem of her water glass, twisting it absently. "I don't remember much from when I was very young. Obviously, Sister Margaret told me I was brought in as a newborn, maybe 2 or 3 days old. Someone had wrapped me in a beautiful blanket and left me with the medallion and a note." John's heart hammered against his ribs. "A note? Nothing detailed. Just something about wanting me to have a good life, and hoping someday I'd understand. Sister Margaret showed it to me once when I was older. The handwriting was elegant, educated. It made me think whoever wrote it wasn't illiterate or desperate in the usual sense. Please take care of her. She deserves better than I can give her right now. Tell her someday that she was loved." John remembered every word he'd written on that note 25 years ago. His hand shaking so badly he'd had to write it 3 times before it was legible. "Did the sisters try to find your parents?" Sophie shrugged. "Sister Margaret said they made some inquiries, but there wasn't much to go on. No last names, no addresses. Just me, the blanket, the medallion, and the note." It wasn't uncommon. Sometimes parents who can't care for their children just want to make sure they're safe. Their waiter appeared, and John was grateful for the interruption. He needed a moment to compose himself, to push down the tide of emotion threatening to overwhelm him. They ordered. Linguine for Sophie. Risotto for John, though he doubted he'd be able to eat much. "What was it like?" he asked when they were alone again. "Growing up there." Sophie's expression softened. "Better than you might think. Actually, St. Joseph's isn't like the orphanages you see in movies. The sisters were kind, and they made sure we all got good educations. Sister Margaret in particular, she was like a mother to me. She noticed that I picked up languages easily and encouraged me to keep learning. She sounds like a special woman." She is, Sophie corrected. "She's retired now, but I still visit her sometimes. She lives in a little apartment near the old orphanage. It's been converted to low-income housing, but she wanted to stay in the neighborhood." Sophie smiled. She always said that some children are meant to build bridges between worlds. I think that's why she pushed me so hard with the languages. John found himself leaning forward, hungry for every detail of the life he'd missed. What other languages do you speak? Let's see. Spanish, French, German, Italian, Portuguese, and I'm working on Mandarin. Oh, and I can get by in Russian, though my pronunciation is terrible. She laughed, and the sound went straight to his heart. Sister Margaret used to joke that I was collecting languages like other kids collected baseball cards. That's extraordinary. Most people struggle with one foreign language. I think it's partly just how my brain works, and partly necessity. When you grow up not knowing where you come from, you start looking for clues everywhere. I thought maybe if I could speak enough languages, I'd eventually meet someone who recognized my story, or knew something about my family. Have you ever found any clues, apart from the medallion? Sophie shook her head. Nothing concrete, though. She hesitated, looking almost embarrassed. This might sound crazy, but sometimes when I'm speaking certain languages, I feel like I'm remembering something. Not specific words or conversations, just a feeling like maybe I heard those sounds when I was very small. John's chest tightened. He and Olivia had spoken Spanish together. It was one of the things that had drawn him to her, the way she'd switch between languages when she was excited or upset. They'd made plans to raise their daughter bilingual, to give her that gift of multiple cultures. That doesn't sound crazy at all, he said quietly. Memory works in mysterious ways. Their food arrived, and they ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. John watched Sophie's face as she savored the linguine. Noting the way she closed her eyes briefly when she encountered a particularly good bite, Olivia had done the same thing, approached food with a kind of sensual appreciation that came from never taking abundance for granted. "Can I ask you something?" Sophie said suddenly. "Of course. Why are you being so kind to me? I mean, I'm just a waitress. You're this successful businessman, and you're taking time out of your Saturday night to have dinner with someone you barely know." John set down his fork, choosing his words carefully. "You remind me of someone I cared about very much. Someone who had dreams similar to yours. The person you mentioned losing." "Yes." The word came out hoarse. "She was around your age when I knew her. Brilliant, determined, full of hope for the future. And He stopped, unable to continue. Sophie reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. "I'm sorry. It's clear she meant a lot to you." "She did." They both did. Both. John realized his mistake immediately. But it was too late to take it back. She had a child. A daughter. What happened to them? For a moment, John considered telling her everything. The words pressed against his throat like caged birds desperate for release. But fear held him back. Fear of her reaction. Fear of losing this fragile connection before it had a chance to grow. "Circumstances separated us," he said finally. "I've regretted it every day since." Sophie studied his face with those perceptive autumn eyes. "Is that why you're helping me? Because I remind you of her daughter?" "Partly," John admitted. "But also because you deserve help. You're working hard. You have clear goals. And you're not letting your circumstances define your future. That takes courage. Sometimes I don't feel very courageous. Sometimes I feel like I'm just making it up as I go along. That's what courage is," John said. "Doing what needs to be done even when you're scared." They talked for another hour. And John found himself marveling at Sophie's resilience and intelligence. She spoke passionately about her dreams of working in international diplomacy, of using her language skills to help people communicate across cultural barriers. She was everything he'd hoped his daughter might become, and more. As they prepared to leave, Sophie hesitated at the restaurant door. "John, can I ask you something else? Anything. Do you think it's possible to forgive someone for leaving you, even if you don't understand why they did it?" The question hit him like a physical blow. "I think," he said carefully, "that sometimes people make choices that seem impossible to understand from the outside, and sometimes forgiveness is more about freeing yourself than absolving them." Sophie nodded slowly. "Sister Margaret used to say that carrying anger was like carrying a hot coal. It burns you more than anyone else." She sounds like a wise woman. "She is," Sophie smiled. "Thank you for dinner, John, and for listening. It's been a long time since I've talked to anyone about all this." As John watched her walk away into the Chicago night, His hand moved instinctively to his jacket pocket, where his grandmother's medallion waited. Soon, he promised himself. Soon he would find the courage to tell her the truth. But first, he needed to be absolutely certain. He needed to verify what his heart already knew. Monday morning found him in his lawyer's office, requesting the services of a private investigator. By Tuesday afternoon, he had confirmation. Sophie Marie Collins, born at Chicago General Hospital 25 years and 3 months ago. Mother listed as Olivia Martinez, father unknown, surrendered to St. Joseph of the Blossoms Orphanage 3 days after birth. The investigator's report was thorough and impersonal, reducing 25 years of a young woman's life to dates and addresses and academic records. But for John, it was everything. It was proof that hope could survive even the deepest regret. It was confirmation that his daughter was alive, and brilliant, and more remarkable than he'd ever dared to dream. Now he just had to figure out how to tell her. John carried the investigator's report in his briefcase for 3 days before he found the courage to return to the Golden Pearl. The manila envelope seemed to burn through the leather, a physical reminder of the truth he now possessed but didn't know how to share. When he finally walked through the restaurant's doors on Friday evening, Sophie's face lit up with genuine pleasure, a reaction that both thrilled and terrified him. How would she look at him once she knew the truth? Would that warmth turn to anger? Or worse, disgust? John, I wasn't expecting to see you tonight. Your usual table. Actually, I was hoping we might talk again. When your shift ends, perhaps. Sophie glanced around the busy dining room. I get off at 10. But are you sure you want to wait that long? It's Friday night. This place will be packed until closing. I'll wait. John nursed a single glass of wine for 3 hours, watching Sophie work. She moved through the crowded restaurant with practiced grace, switching languages as easily as breathing. He found himself cataloging every gesture, every expression, trying to memorize moments he'd already lost too many of, when a particularly demanding customer snapped at her in French, calling her incompetent for a kitchen delay that wasn't her fault. John had to grip his wine glass to keep from intervening. Sophie handled it with perfect professionalism, apologizing smoothly and offering a complimentary dessert. But John saw the slight tightening around her eyes, the way her shoulders tensed. He wanted to tell that customer exactly what he thought of anyone who treated his daughter with disrespect. His daughter. The words still felt surreal, even with the investigative report as proof. At 10:15, Sophie emerged from the employee area wearing jeans and a light sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked young and beautiful, and completely unaware that her entire world was about to change. Sorry to keep you waiting. Fridays are always crazy. No problem at all. Would you like to go somewhere quieter? There's a coffee shop around the corner that stays open late. They walked the 3 blocks in comfortable silence, the cool October air carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant lake water. The coffee shop was nearly empty except for a few college students hunched over laptops, and they found a corner table away from prying eyes. You seem different tonight, Sophie observed as she wrapped her hands around her latte. More serious. Is everything okay? John pulled the manila envelope from his briefcase and set it on the table between them. His hands were shaking slightly, and he hoped she didn't notice. Sophie, I need to tell you something. About the person I mentioned losing. About why you remind me of her. Sophie's eyes dropped to the envelope, then back to his face. John, you're making me nervous. Her name was Olivia, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. Olivia Martinez. She was beautiful and brilliant and full of dreams. She worked as a cleaning lady at my father's company while putting herself through night school. Recognition flickered in Sophie's eyes at the mention of the name, but she said nothing. I was 22 when I met her. Spoiled, entitled, completely unprepared for someone like her. She saw something good in me that I didn't even know existed. John's fingers traced the edge of the envelope. We fell in love. It was the kind of love that changes everything. Your priorities, your dreams, your entire vision of what life could be. What happened to her? Sophie's voice was quiet. Careful. She got pregnant. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge. Neither of them was sure they wanted to cross. Sophie's face had gone very still, very pale. My family, they didn't approve. They said terrible things about her, made threats. They told me she was trying to trap me, that I was throwing my life away. John's laugh was bitter. I was weak. I convinced myself that walking away was protecting her, protecting the baby. I left money, made arrangements for the child to go to a good orphanage. I told myself I was being noble. Sophie's hands had gone motionless around her coffee cup. The baby? What happened to the baby? John reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his grandmother's medallion, setting it on the table next to the envelope. The silver caught the coffee shop's warm lighting, throwing tiny shadows across the scarred wooden surface. I left this with her. It belonged to my grandmother, the only member of my family who would have loved Olivia and accepted our child. I wanted the baby to have something that connected her to the good parts of our family. Sophie stared at the medallion as if it were a snake that might strike. With trembling fingers, she reached beneath her sweater and pulled out her own chain. The two medallions lay side by side on the table, identical in every detail. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Sophie." John's voice broke on her name. "I'm your father." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie looked from the medallions to John's face and back again, her expression cycling through disbelief, recognition, and something that might have been grief. "You're lying," she said finally, but there was no conviction in it. "I wish I were. I've been lying to myself for 25 years, telling myself I did the right thing. But seeing you, talking to you, Sophie, you're everything I hoped you'd become, and more than I deserve to have as a daughter." Sophie stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor loud enough to draw stares from the other patrons. "I need air. I need to think." She rushed toward the door, and John followed, leaving money on the table without counting it. Outside, Sophie was pacing the sidewalk like a caged animal, her breath coming in short. Sharp bursts. 25 years, she said when he approached. 25 years I've been wondering who I am, where I came from, why I was abandoned, and you've been here in Chicago the whole time. Yes, you could have found me, you could have checked on me, made sure I was okay, but you didn't. I convinced myself that I was protecting you by staying away, that you were better off without me. Sophie whirled to face him, her eyes blazing. Better off? Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up with no identity, no medical history, no family traditions, no sense of where you belong in the world? Sophie, please, I used to make up stories about you, she continued, her voice rising. About my parents. I imagined you were travelers who died in an accident. Or maybe you were young and scared but loved me. I never imagined that you were rich and comfortable and just chose not to care. That's not how it was. Then how was it? She demanded. Explain to me how abandoning your child was the noble thing to do. Explain to me how you slept at night knowing your daughter was 3 miles away in an orphanage. John felt tears he hadn't shed in decades threatening to spill. I didn't sleep. I haven't slept well for 25 years. Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone I imagined you reaching. It was torture, but I thought I'd burned that bridge, that showing up in your life would only cause more pain. So you stayed away out of kindness. Sophie's laugh was sharp and humorless. How generous of you. Across the street, a black sedan had been parked for the past 10 minutes with its engine running. In the front seat, Marcus Ashcroft lowered a pair of binoculars and smiled coldly. Well, he murmured to his companion. Looks like John Thorne has been keeping secrets. This is even better than we hoped. Ashcroft pulled out his phone and speed-dialed his brother. Richard, you're going to want to hear this. Our dear friend Thorne has a weakness we didn't know about. A very public, very exploitable weakness. Back on the sidewalk, Sophie was still raging. Do you know what the worst part is? I defended you. When Sister Margaret would find me crying about being abandoned, I'd tell her that maybe my parents had good reasons. Maybe they loved me so much they gave me up so I could have a better life. Sophie, that's exactly... No. She cut him off with a sharp gesture. Don't you dare tell me this was about love. Love doesn't abandon. Love doesn't stay away for 25 years. Love fights for what matters. John stood there taking the verbal blows, knowing he deserved everyone. In the distance, he noticed the black sedan pulling away from the curb, but his attention was focused entirely on his daughter's pain. Pain he had caused. You're right, he said quietly. I was a coward. I told myself I was protecting you, but really I was protecting myself. I was 22 and weak and scared of my father's threats. I chose the easy path. Some of the fire went out of Sophie's posture at his admission. At least you're honest about it now. I can't undo the past, Sophie, but I can try to be the father you deserved from the beginning, if you'll let me. Sophie stared at him for a long moment, her face a battlefield of emotions. I don't know if I can. I don't know if I want to. I understand. Do you? Do you really? She shook her head. I need time to process this. I need to figure out how I feel about having a father who's been hiding in plain sight my entire life. Of course, take all the time you need. Sophie started to walk away, then turned back. One question, my mother. Olivia. What happened to her? John's face crumpled. She died 2 years after you were born. Cancer. By the time I heard, it was too late to... I couldn't even go to her funeral. She died alone. I don't know. I hope not. Sophie nodded once, sharply, then turned and walked away into the Chicago night. John watched until she disappeared around a corner, then looked down at the 2 medallions still clutched in his fist. He'd found his daughter at last, only to lose her all over again. What he didn't know was that across the city, the Ashcroft brothers were already planning how to use this revelation to destroy him once and for all. Sophie didn't show up for work the next day. John learned this when he called the Golden Pearl at noon, his voice carefully casual as he asked the maitre d' if Miss Collins was working the lunch shift. The man's response, that Sophie had called in sick and wouldn't be in for the weekend, sent John into a spiral of panic and regret. He drove past her apartment building twice that afternoon, a modest 3-story walk-up in Wicker Park that his private investigator had identified as her address. Both times, he slowed but didn't stop. What would he say? How could he possibly make this right? By Sunday evening, the waiting had become unbearable. John found himself standing outside Sophie's building at 8 o'clock, his grandmother's medallion heavy in his pocket, alongside the one Sophie had left behind in her shock. He'd picked it up from the coffee shop table after she'd fled, the chain broken where she'd yanked it off in her haste to get away from him. The building's lobby was small and tired-looking, with mailboxes that had seen better days, and a security door that buzzed him through when he pressed the button for apartment 3B. He climbed the narrow stairs slowly, each step feeling like a march toward judgment. Sophie answered his knock after a long pause, and John's heart broke at the sight of her. She looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed, and her usually perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore an oversized Northwestern sweatshirt and yoga pants, and she looked younger than her 25 years. I wondered when you'd show up, she said quietly. Stepping aside to let him in, her apartment was small, but bright, with tall windows that let in the late afternoon light. Books were everywhere, stacked on shelves, piled on the coffee table, scattered across the couch. Most were language textbooks, or international relations texts, but John spotted novels in at least 4 different languages mixed in among them. I brought this, John said, holding out the broken chain with her medallion. You dropped it. Sophie took it from him but didn't put it on. Instead, she set it on the coffee table next to a box of tissues and a mug of what smelled like chamomile tea. I've been thinking, she said, settling onto the couch and drawing her knees up to her chest. About everything you told me, about Olivia, my mother, about why you left. John remained standing, afraid that sitting would make this feel too casual, too comfortable. And I looked her up online. Olivia Martinez. There wasn't much. An obituary from the Tribune, a mention in the community college newsletter about a scholarship fund established in her memory. Sophie's voice was carefully controlled. She wanted to be a teacher. Did you know that? Yes. She used to talk about opening a bilingual preschool, helping immigrant kids learn English while staying connected to their heritage. She was 24 when she died. Cervical cancer. Sophie's hands tightened around her knees. The obituary said she was survived by family in Puerto Rico. I have family, and I never knew. The accusation in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. John closed his eyes. I should have told you. I should have helped you find them. Yes, you should have. Sophie stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. I called the number from the obituary yesterday. Found a cousin, Carmen. She remembered Olivia. Remembered that she'd gotten pregnant by some rich white boy who disappeared when things got complicated. John flinched. That's accurate. Carmen said Olivia never spoke badly of you, even after you left. She said Olivia told the family that you were young and scared, and that she hoped someday you'd find your way back to your daughter. She was a better person than I deserved. Sophie turned from the window, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She was, and she loved you, despite everything. Carmen said Olivia kept one picture of you, just one, hidden in her jewelry box. She'd look at it sometimes when she thought no one was watching. The words hit John like physical blows. He sank into the chair across from the couch, overwhelmed by grief for the woman he'd loved and lost through his own cowardice. "There's more," Sophie continued. "Carmen told me about the money." John looked up sharply. "What about it?" "The trust fund you set up. It paid for my education at St. Joseph's, my college prep courses, everything the orphanage couldn't cover from their regular budget. Sister Margaret never told me where the money came from, just that I had a benefactor who wanted to remain anonymous. I wanted to make sure you had opportunities. Guilt money." Sophie's voice was flat. "You thought throwing money at the problem would make up for abandoning your child." "No, John stopped, recognizing the truth in her words. "Maybe. Partly. I don't know anymore. I told myself I was providing for you. But you're right. It was probably more about assuaging my own guilt." They stood in silence for several moments, the weight of 25 years of separation and misunderstanding settling between them like dust. "I don't know how to do this," Sophie said finally. "I don't know how to have a father. I don't know how to be one," John admitted. "I gave up that right a long time ago, but you want to try?" The question hung in the air like a bridge. Neither of them was sure would hold their weight. John looked at this remarkable young woman, his daughter, and felt a love so fierce it threatened to overwhelm him. "More than anything," he said, "but only if you want to try too." Sophie was quiet for a long time, her gaze moving between John's face and the broken medallion on her coffee table. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I used to dream about this moment, about finding my father and having him explain why he left. In my dreams, he always had a perfect reason. He was protecting me from danger, or he was sick and didn't want me to watch him die, or he was searching for a cure for some terrible disease." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I never imagined he'd just been afraid. I'm sorry I wasn't the father you dreamed of." "You're here now," Sophie said. "That has to count for something." Before John could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, then frowned. The message was from an unknown number, but the content made his blood run cold. "Lovely daughter you have there, Thorne. Would hate for anything to happen to her. Check tomorrow's Tribune for a preview of what's coming. John, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." John's mind raced. The Ashcrofts. It had to be them. But how did they know about Sophie? Unless... "Sophie, I need you to listen carefully. You might be in danger." "What are you talking about?" John showed her the text message, watching as confusion gave way to fear in her eyes. "I have enemies. People who would use you to get to me, if they know about our connection. Who would do something like that? The Ashcroft family. I ruined them in a business deal several years ago. They've been looking for a way to strike back ever since." Sophie sank onto the couch, the color draining from her face. "This is because of you. Because I'm your daughter." "I won't let anything happen to you," John said fiercely. "I'll hire security. Move you somewhere safe." "No," Sophie's voice was sharp. "I won't be a prisoner because of your past mistakes. I've built a life here, John. I have friends, a job, plans for the future. Sophie, please, these people are dangerous." "Then maybe you should have thought about that before you involved me in your life." The words stung, but John couldn't argue with them. By revealing himself as her father, he'd painted a target on her back. Another way he'd failed to protect her. "There's something else," he said reluctantly. "The text mentioned tomorrow's Tribune. Whatever they're planning, it's going to be public." Sophie buried her face in her hands. "This is insane. Yesterday I was just a waitress trying to save money for graduate school. Now I'm apparently the secret daughter of a millionaire with vengeful enemies. I can fix this," John said desperately. "I can make them go away. How? I don't know yet, but I will. I promise you, Sophie. I won't let my past destroy your future." Sophie looked up at him, and for a moment, John saw something in her eyes that looked almost like trust. What if it's too late? What if knowing who my father is changes everything, whether I want it to or not? Then we face it together, John said, if you'll let me. Sophie picked up her broken medallion, turning it over in her hands. I don't forgive you, she said quietly. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I don't want to lose you again either. That's enough, John said. That's more than I deserve. As he prepared to leave, Sophie called his name. John, whatever happens tomorrow, whatever they publish in the paper, I want you to know that I'm glad I finally know the truth, even if it complicates everything. John nodded, not trusting his voice. As he walked back to his car, he pulled out his phone and called his head of security. Whatever the Ashcrofts were planning, he would be ready for them. He'd failed to protect Sophie once. He wouldn't make the same mistake twice. The Tribune hit the stands at 5 a.m. By 6, John's phone was ringing nonstop. By 7, the story had been picked up by 3 local news stations. By 8, his assistant was fielding calls from national media outlets hungry for details about Chicago's most eligible bachelor and his secret love child. The headline was everything the Ashcrofts could have hoped for. Millionaire's hidden shame. John Thorne's abandoned daughter works as waitress while he lives in luxury. The article was a masterpiece of innuendo and selective facts. It painted John as a heartless playboy who'd seduced an innocent young woman, abandoned her when she became pregnant, and left his daughter to grow up in poverty while he built his empire. There were quotes from anonymous sources claiming John had always known where Sophie was, but had chosen to ignore her existence. The piece included a photograph of Sophie taken outside the Golden Pearl, clearly shot with a telephoto lens without her knowledge. She looked young and vulnerable in her server's uniform. And the caption identified her as Sophie Collins, 25, who has struggled to make ends meet, while her millionaire father ignored her existence. John read the article 3 times in his downtown office, each reading making him angrier. The facts were technically accurate, but twisted to create the worst possible impression. By the time his legal team arrived for an emergency meeting, he was ready to sue the Tribune into oblivion. We can file for invasion of privacy, defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, his lead attorney Patricia Walsh said as she spread legal briefs across his conference table. But John, you need to understand, this is going to get worse before it gets better. Every media outlet in the city will be trying to get an exclusive with Sophie. Then we protect her, round-the-clock security, legal injunctions. You can't force someone into witness protection, John. Sophie's an adult. She has to cooperate willingly. John's assistant knocked and entered. Mr. Thorne, Sophie Collins is here to see you. She says it's urgent. Sophie walked into the conference room looking like she hadn't slept in days. She wore jeans and a Northwestern hoodie, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, and she carried a copy of the Tribune clutched in her white-knuckled fist. Have you seen this? She demanded, slapping the newspaper onto the conference table. Sophie, I'm so sorry. I never wanted... They made me sound like some pathetic charity case. Her voice cracked with emotion. My co-workers are calling me. Reporters are camping outside my apartment, and my neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, actually asked me if I was going to take my rich daddy for everything he's worth. Patricia Walsh cleared her throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. No, Sophie said firmly. If we're family, then we deal with family business together, right? The word family hit John like a punch to the chest. Despite everything, despite her anger and hurt, Sophie was claiming him as her father. The story is full of lies, John said. We can fight this. Prove that. Can we prove you didn't abandon me? Sophie interrupted. Because that part's true, isn't it? Sophie, the rest doesn't matter. She sank into one of the leather chairs around the conference table. They can say whatever they want about the money or the reasons or the timeline, but the basic fact remains. You left and I grew up without a father. John dismissed his legal team with a gesture, waiting until the conference room door closed before speaking again. What do you want me to do? I want you to tell me about her. Sophie's voice was quiet now, the fight gone out of her. About my mother, the real story, not the sanitized version you gave me before. John moved to the window that looked out over the Chicago River, gathering his thoughts. Olivia was luminous. That's the only word that fits. She had this way of lighting up a room just by walking into it. How did you meet? I was working late one night at my father's office. trying to prove myself worthy of eventually taking over the company. She was part of the cleaning crew. I heard someone singing in Spanish down the hall and went to investigate. John smiled at the memory. She was mopping the floor in my father's office, singing this beautiful song about lost love. When she saw me, she was mortified. She thought she'd get in trouble for making noise. But you didn't report her. I asked her to teach me the song. John's reflection in the window looked older than his 55 years. She laughed and said I'd never be able to roll my R's properly, but she was patient with me. We started talking every night when she came to clean. She was taking English and business classes at the community college, working 3 jobs to pay tuition. Sophie had gone very still, hanging on every word. She was brilliant, Sophie. Sharper than most of the MBAs my father hired. She understood people, understood what motivated them. She would have been an incredible teacher. When did you fall in love with her? The night she told me about her family in Puerto Rico. Her grandmother who'd raised 5 children alone after her husband died in a factory accident. Her mother who'd cleaned houses for 30 years to send money back home. Olivia was carrying on that tradition, working multiple jobs so she could support her mother and help pay for her younger brother's education. John turned from the window. She wasn't just beautiful, Sophie. She was good, in a way that I'd never encountered in my privileged little world. What about the pregnancy? Were you happy about it? John's face crumpled, terrified and thrilled at the same time. We'd been talking about marriage, about me breaking away from my father's business and starting something of our own. When Olivia told me she was pregnant, it felt like the universe was pushing us toward the life we'd dreamed about. But your family found out. My father had me followed. He knew about Olivia before I worked up the courage to tell him myself. John's voice turned bitter. He called her a gold digger, a fortune hunter who'd trapped me with a pregnancy. He threatened to destroy her reputation, to make sure she never worked in Chicago again. He said he'd make her life so miserable she'd disappear on her own. Sophie was crying now, silent tears tracking down her cheeks. What did she say when you told her you were leaving? I never told her. The admission came out as barely more than a whisper. I was too much of a coward. I left a letter with the money and the arrangements for the baby. I told her I thought it was best for everyone if I stepped aside. You broke her heart. I destroyed it. Carmen was right. Olivia never spoke badly of me to your extended family, but she never forgave me either. The investigator I hired found her medical records from when you were born. She listed your father as unknown on the birth certificate. Sophie wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her hoodie. She erased you. She had every right to. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of old grief and newer understanding settling between them. Finally, Sophie spoke. I don't know how to forgive you for leaving her, for leaving me. I don't expect you to, but I don't know how to hate you either. Sophie looked up at him with eyes that were achingly familiar. Olivia's eyes, but with his mother's stubborn determination. You were young and scared, and you made a terrible choice, but you also made sure I was safe, that I had opportunities. You've been trying to make up for it ever since. It's not enough. No, Sophie agreed. It's not, but it's something. John's phone buzzed with another news alert. Sophie glanced at it and sighed. They're not going to leave us alone, are they? The reporters, the photographers, all of it. Probably not, at least not for a while. Sophie stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city where she'd been born and abandoned and somehow found her way back to her father. I called in sick to work again today. I can't face the stares and the questions, but I can't hide forever either. You could take some time, travel maybe. I have houses in... No, Sophie's voice was firm. I won't run away. That's what you did, and look how that turned out. John felt the rebuke like a slap, but he recognized the justice in it. Then what do you want to do? Sophie turned from the window, and for the first time since she'd learned the truth, John saw something like resolve in her expression. I want to figure out how to be your daughter without losing myself in the process. I want to learn about Olivia from someone who really knew her, and I want those Ashcroft people to understand that they picked the wrong family to mess with. Despite everything, John found himself smiling. You sound like your mother. She never backed down from a fight either. Good, Sophie said, because I have a feeling we're going to need that trait in the days ahead. The Ashcroft mansion sat on 2 acres of prime real estate in Kenilworth. its Gothic revival architecture casting long shadows across manicured lawns that had once been the envy of Chicago's North Shore elite. Now the gardens showed signs of neglect. Hedges that needed trimming, flower beds choked with weeds, a fountain that had run dry years ago inside the mansion's oak-paneled study. Marcus and Richard Ashcroft pored over newspaper clippings and photographs spread across an antique mahogany desk. The walls around them bore the ghostly outlines of paintings that had been sold to pay debts, and the Persian rug beneath their feet showed worn patches where priceless furniture had once stood. The Tribune's story was just the beginning, Marcus said, his thin fingers drumming against the desk's leather inlay. Now that we've established the connection between Thorne and the girl, we can move to phase 2. Richard, the younger and more volatile of the brothers, studied a telephoto shot of Sophie entering John's office building. She's prettier than I expected. Almost seems ashamed to involve her in this. Don't go soft on me now, Marcus warned. John Thorne destroyed our family. He used insider information to sabotage our pharmaceutical deal with the Germans, then bought our company assets at bankruptcy prices. We lost everything because of that man. I know the history. Marcus, I lived it too. Richard set down the photograph. But this girl, she's innocent. She didn't even know Thorne was her father until a week ago. Innocent or not, she's our leverage, Thorne's weakness. Marcus pulled out a detailed floor plan of the Golden Pearl restaurant. He's been meeting her there regularly. Tonight's the perfect opportunity. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Marcus had spent weeks cultivating contacts within the Golden Pearl's staff, identifying which employees could be bought and which security measures could be circumvented. A carefully orchestrated power outage would create chaos and confusion. In the darkness, hired men would grab Sophie and disappear into the Chicago night before anyone realized what had happened. The power grid in that district is notoriously unreliable, Marcus explained, tracing routes on a city map. One small explosion at the right transformer, and 6 blocks go dark. Emergency services will be overwhelmed with calls. And then, we extract the girl, take her somewhere secure, send Thorne a simple message. He destroyed our lives. Now we have the power to destroy his. He'll do anything to get his daughter back. Richard studied his brother's face, noting the fevered gleam in his eyes that had grown more pronounced since their father's suicide 3 years earlier. What exactly do you want from him? Money, a public apology. I want him to feel what we felt when he took everything from us. The helplessness, the desperation, the knowledge that someone else controls your fate. Marcus's voice dropped to a whisper. I want him to beg. What the Ashcroft brothers didn't know was that John's head of security, a former FBI agent named Tom Kellerman, had been conducting his own investigation. While they'd been careful to avoid electronic communications, Marcus's payments to corrupt restaurant employees had left a paper trail that Kellerman had been following for days. At the Golden Pearl, Sophie was trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, despite the media circus surrounding her newly revealed parentage. She'd returned to work that morning against John's advice, determined not to let the Ashcrofts or anyone else drive her into hiding. You sure you're okay, honey? Asked Maria Santos, the restaurant's head hostess and Sophie's closest friend among the staff. You've seemed jumpy all day. Sophie glanced around the dining room, noting the way some customers whispered and pointed when they thought she wasn't looking. Just adjusting to being Chicago's most famous orphan, she said with forced lightness. The story in the Tribune was garbage, Maria said loyally. Anyone who works with you knows what kind of person you are. You've never asked for handouts or special treatment. Tell that to the reporters camping outside my apartment. Maria lowered her voice. Speaking of which, your father's here. Table 12. Sophie looked across the dining room to where John sat alone, pretending to read a menu he'd memorized years ago. He'd been coming to the restaurant every evening since the story broke, claiming he wanted to be nearby in case she needed anything. Sophie suspected he was more worried about the Ashcrofts than he'd let on. I'll take his table, Sophie said, smoothing her uniform and checking her reflection in a mirrored pillar. Sophie, John looked up as she approached, and she was struck by how tired he seemed. How are you holding up? One day at a time. She pulled out her order pad, maintaining the pretense that this was just another customer interaction. The usual. Actually, I was hoping we could talk after your shift. There are some things about your mother I'd like to share. Stories. Photos. I kept more than I probably should have. Sophie felt her heart skip. "You have pictures of her." "A few, and some letters she wrote me before." John's voice trailed off. "If you'd like to see them." "I'd like that very much," as Sophie took his order and moved to other tables. Neither of them noticed the unusual activity in the restaurant's service areas. 2 maintenance workers who'd never been seen before were supposedly checking electrical systems. A new busboy had started that morning, claiming the regular employee had called in sick. And in the kitchen, the sous chef kept glancing at his watch with nervous anticipation. At 8:30 p.m., Marcus Ashcroft sat in a rented van 3 blocks away, monitoring radio chatter from the corrupt security guards he'd placed inside the restaurant. "Status report," he said into his headset. "Targets are both present," came the reply. "Thorne's at table 12, the girl's working the dinner service. All systems are go. Remember, we want the girl unharmed. She's no good to us as leverage if she's injured." "Understood." Marcus checked his watch. In exactly 15 minutes, a small explosive device would destroy a power transformer, plunging 6 city blocks into darkness in the confusion that followed. His men would grab Sophie and spirit her away through the restaurant's service entrance. By the time power was restored and emergency services arrived, she'd be miles away in a secure location. It was a solid plan with one fatal flaw. Marcus had underestimated Tom Kellerman's thoroughness. At 8:40 p.m., just 5 minutes before the scheduled blackout, a team of federal agents and Chicago police surrounded the restaurant. Kellerman himself entered through the main door, his weapon concealed but his badge clearly visible. Sophie was serving coffee to a table of foreign investors when she noticed the sudden tension among the staff. The new busboy had gone pale and was backing toward the kitchen. One of the supposed maintenance workers was speaking urgently into a radio, and across the dining room, she saw Kellerman approaching John's table with grim purpose. "What's happening?" she asked as she reached them. "We need to get you out of here," Kellerman said quietly. "Both of you now." Before anyone could move, the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a moment later, bathing the restaurant in an eerie red glow. Customers began murmuring nervously, and some started moving toward the exits. In the confusion, Sophie saw the fake busboy pulling something from his jacket, something that gleamed metal in the emergency lights. "Gun!" Kellerman shouted, pushing Sophie behind an overturned table as the first shots rang out. John threw himself forward, covering Sophie with his body as chaos erupted around them. Customers screamed and dove for cover while Kellerman and his backup team engaged the armed intruders in a fierce gunfight. "This way," Kellerman shouted over the noise, indicating a path toward the kitchen. "We need to get you to the safe room." But as they moved, Sophie saw something that made her blood freeze. More armed men were coming through the service entrance, cutting off their escape route. They were trapped between 2 groups of attackers, with no way out except through the dining room where bullets were flying. "Stay down," John whispered, his arms tightening around her. "Whatever happens, stay down." Sophie looked up at his face in the red emergency lighting and saw something she'd never expected to see there. Fierce, protective love. This man who'd abandoned her as a baby was now willing to die to keep her safe. For the first time since learning the truth about her parentage, Sophie understood that love and fear and terrible choices were more complicated than she'd ever imagined. And as gunfire continued to echo through the Golden Pearl, she found herself praying that she'd have the chance to tell him she was beginning to forgive him. The battle for Sophie's life was just beginning. The gunfight lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, when the smoke cleared and the emergency lights stopped flashing. 3 of the Ashcrofts' hired gunmen lay unconscious. Zip-tied by Kellerman's team, the fake maintenance workers had surrendered without firing a shot, and the corrupt busboy was being read his rights while paramedics treated a flesh wound on his shoulder. But Marcus Ashcroft himself was nowhere to be found. "Son of a bitch slipped away in the chaos," Kellerman reported to John as they stood in the Golden Pearl's devastated dining room. Overturned tables, shattered wine glasses, and bullet holes in the mahogany walls bore testament to how close they'd come to disaster. He was running the operation from a mobile command center 3 blocks away. By the time we got there, he'd vanished. Sophie sat on a banquette in the corner, wrapped in a police blanket and nursing a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She hadn't spoken much since the shooting stopped, just stared at the destruction around her with shell-shocked eyes. "How many of them got away?" John asked quietly, not wanting Sophie to hear details that might frighten her further. "At least 2, maybe 3, Marcus, his brother Richard, and probably one other operative. They're professionals, John. This isn't over. John looked across the room at his daughter and felt his heart constrict. 25 years of staying away to protect her, and now his presence in her life had made her a target for dangerous men with nothing left to lose. We need to get her somewhere safe. Already arranged, there's a safe house in Lake Forest. No. Sophie's voice cut across their conversation. She stood up, letting the blanket fall to the floor, and walked over to them with determined steps. I'm not going into hiding. Sophie, these people tried to kidnap you tonight, John said gently. They'll try again. Let them try. Her voice was steady, but John could see the fire in her eyes. Olivia's fire, burning bright and fierce. I've spent my whole life being defined by other people's choices. My birth parents who gave me up. The sisters at the orphanage who raised me. Even you with your guilt money and secret watching from afar. I'm not going to let some bitter old men drive me underground now. Detective Sarah Chen, the lead investigator on the case, looked up from her notepad. Miss Collins, I understand your frustration, but these aren't ordinary criminals. The Ashcrofts have resources, connections. They've been planning this for months. Then we plan better. Sophie turned to Kellerman. You said they're professionals. What does that mean exactly? Kellerman exchanged glances with John, clearly uncomfortable with sharing tactical details with a civilian. It means they have training, funding, and patience. They'll wait for another opportunity. Good. That gives us time to prepare. Sophie's chin lifted in a gesture John recognized from his own mother. What do we know about their next move? Sophie, John said carefully. This isn't a game. You could be killed. I could be killed crossing the street tomorrow, or I could spend the rest of my life running from shadows. She looked directly at him, and John saw steel beneath the fear in her eyes. Is that what you want for me? A life spent hiding? Before John could answer, his phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and frowned. Unknown number, but the area code was local. Answer it, Kellerman advised. We'll trace the call. John put the phone on speaker. Hello? Marcus Ashcroft's cultured voice filled the room. Good evening, John. I trust everyone survived tonight's excitement. What do you want, Marcus? What I've always wanted. Justice, retribution, the knowledge that you've felt even a fraction of the pain you caused my family. There was a pause, then a sound that might have been laughter. You cost me my father, my fortune, my future. Tonight was just a preview of what's coming. Sophie stepped closer to the phone. This is Sophie Collins. You want to threaten someone? Threaten me directly. Ah, the long-lost daughter speaks. Marcus's voice turned silky. How refreshing to hear such spirit. Your father never told you about us. Did he? About how he destroyed the Ashcroft Pharmaceutical Company through insider trading and corporate espionage? That's not... John started, but Sophie held up a hand to silence him. I don't care what happened between you and my father 20 years ago, she said evenly. That's your problem, not mine. But you made it my problem when you decided to use me as a weapon against him. Smart girl, beauty, and brains. You're quite the prize, aren't you? John's hands clenched into fists, but Sophie remained calm. Here's what's going to happen, she continued. You're going to turn yourself in to the police. Along with your brother and anyone else involved in tonight's attack, you're going to plead guilty to kidnapping conspiracy, armed assault, and whatever else they can charge you with. Marcus's laughter was sharp and unpleasant. And why would I do that? Because if you don't, I'm going to make it my personal mission to destroy whatever's left of your pathetic life. I have my father's resources now, and I have something you don't. The moral high ground. You think you lost everything when John ruined your business. I'll show you what real loss looks like. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds when Marcus spoke again. His voice had lost its mocking tone. You're making a mistake, girl. This isn't your fight. You made it my fight, and you have no idea who you're dealing with. Sophie's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. I grew up in an orphanage, Marcus. I've been fighting for everything I have since I was old enough to walk. You think some spoiled rich boy who can't handle losing a business deal is going to intimidate me? The line went dead. Detective Chen looked impressed despite herself. That was either very brave or very stupid. Probably both, Sophie admitted, some of the fire going out of her posture. But I meant every word. John stared at his daughter with a mixture of pride and terror. In that moment, she'd sounded like a force of nature, like someone who could reshape the world through sheer force of will. She also sounded like someone who'd just painted an even bigger target on her back. "Sophie," he said quietly, "you don't understand what you've just done. Marcus Ashcroft is unstable. Dangerous. He has nothing left to lose. Good. That makes two of us." She looked around the destroyed restaurant, her gaze lingering on the bullet holes and overturned tables. "This place was where we found each other, wasn't it? Where you finally worked up the courage to tell me the truth." "Yes. Then it seems fitting that it's also where I decided to stop running from the consequences of being your daughter." Sophie picked up her purse from behind the bar where she'd stashed it when the shooting started. "I need to go home and think about tonight, about us, about what comes next. Sophie, please, let us provide security. No bodyguards, John. If I'm going to live as your daughter, I'm going to do it on my own terms." She paused at the restaurant's entrance, looking back at him. "But I want to see those pictures of my mother tomorrow, if that's still okay." "Of course." As Sophie walked out into the Chicago night, Kellerman moved to John's side. "She's got guts, I'll give her that, but guts won't stop a bullet." John watched through the restaurant's front window as Sophie disappeared around the corner, probably heading for the L station. Every instinct screamed at him to follow her, to protect her, to wrap her in enough security to stop an army. But he'd spent 25 years making choices for Sophie without her consent. Tonight, she'd claimed the right to make her own decisions about her life and safety, as terrifying as it was. John had to respect that choice, even if it killed him. "Double the surveillance on her apartment," he told Kellerman quietly. "Unmarked cars, long-distance monitoring. She doesn't want bodyguards, but I'll be damned if I'm going to leave her completely unprotected." "Already done," as John prepared to leave the wreckage of the Golden Pearl. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "She's stronger than you were at her age, but strength won't save her from what's coming. This is far from over." John deleted the message and pocketed his phone. Marcus was right about one thing. This was far from over, but he was wrong about Sophie's strength. She wasn't just strong, she was formidable. And tomorrow, when John showed her the letters and photographs he'd kept hidden for 25 years, she would understand just how much of her mother's warrior spirit lived inside her. The storm was approaching, but Sophie Collins, his daughter, was ready to face it head-on. Sophie never made it to see the photographs. At 11:30 p.m., as she walked the 3 blocks from the L station to her apartment building, a black van pulled alongside the curb. She had exactly enough time to register the sliding door opening and the masked figures inside before a tranquilizer dart hit her neck. Her last conscious thought was that she should have listened to John about the bodyguards. John received the call at midnight. He'd been sitting in his study, surrounded by photo albums and letters he'd planned to share with Sophie the next day. Tangible pieces of Olivia that he'd hoarded like a miser hoards gold. When his phone rang and Kellerman's name appeared on the screen, John knew before answering that his worst fears had been realized. "They have her," Kellerman said without preamble. "Grabbed her 3 blocks from her apartment. We found her purse on the sidewalk and traces of a sedative on a discarded dart." John's vision blurred. The photo album in his lap, filled with pictures of Olivia laughing, dancing, dreaming of a future that would never come, slipped to the floor, scattering memories across expensive Persian carpet. "Where is she?" "We don't know yet, but Marcus called the emergency line 10 minutes ago. He wants to meet with you. Alone. When? Where?" "Tomorrow night. The Golden Pearl. Midnight." John's laugh was hollow, bitter. Of course he wants to finish what he started there. "John, this is obviously a trap. He's using Sophie as bait to get you somewhere isolated and vulnerable." "I know." John stood and walked to his window, looking out at the city lights that had seemed so beautiful just hours earlier. Now they looked cold, distant, stars in an alien sky. "But I'm going anyway." "The hell you are. We'll coordinate with CPD, set up a perimeter." "No." John's voice cut through Kellerman's protest like a blade. "No police. No backup. No clever tactical solutions. Marcus has spent 2 years planning this. He'll have contingencies for everything except one thing. A father willing to trade his life for his daughter's." "John, think about this rationally." "Rational?" John turned from the window. and Kellerman was startled by the transformation in his employer's face. Gone was the polished businessman, the careful corporate executive. In his place stood something primal, desperate, a parent whose child was in mortal danger. Rational went out the window the moment they took Sophie. This is about family now, about love, about making up for 25 years of cowardice. The next day passed in a blur of torment. John tried to work, tried to maintain normal routines, but every moment stretched like an eternity. He kept checking his phone for ransom demands or proof-of-life messages, but Marcus remained silent. The waiting was its own form of torture, exactly what Marcus intended. At 6 p.m., John's phone finally rang. "Having second thoughts, Thorne." Marcus's voice was calm, almost conversational. "Is she alive?" "For now, though I have to say, your daughter has quite the mouth on her. She's been lecturing my associates about the psychological roots of revenge fantasies for the past hour. Fascinating girl, despite everything." John felt a flicker of pride, even kidnapped and terrified. Sophie was showing the intellectual courage that made her remarkable. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand loss, John. Real loss. The kind that hollows you out and leaves you questioning everything you thought you knew about yourself." Marcus paused, and John could hear muffled voices in the background. "But I'm feeling generous tonight. I'll give you a choice. I'm listening. Come to the restaurant at midnight. Come alone. Unarmed. No surveillance. No backup. Walk through that front door and surrender yourself to me. Do that, and I'll let Sophie go. How do I know you'll keep your word? You don't. But what's your alternative? Call the police. I'll kill her before they breach the perimeter. Try to negotiate. I'm past caring about money or deals or rational solutions. This is about justice, John. About balance. You destroyed my family. Now I destroy yours." The line went dead, leaving John alone with his choice. No choice at all, really. He'd failed Sophie once by abandoning her. He wouldn't fail her again. At 11:45 p.m., John stood outside the Golden Pearl, looking through the darkened windows at the restaurant where his life had changed forever. The bullet holes from the previous night's shooting had been temporarily patched, but the damage was still visible, a metaphor for everything that had gone wrong since he'd first walked into Sophie's life. He pushed through the front door at exactly midnight. The restaurant was dark except for emergency lighting that cast eerie red shadows across the dining room. Tables that had been overturned in the previous night's gunfight remained where they'd fallen, creating a maze of obstacles and hiding places. "Marcus," John called out. "I'm here, let Sophie go." Footsteps echoed from the direction of the kitchen, and Marcus Ashcroft emerged from the shadows. He looked older than John remembered, his once polished appearance now haggard and unkempt, but his eyes burned with fanatic intensity. "Welcome back to the scene of the crime," Marcus said, gesturing around the damaged restaurant. "Appropriate, don't you think? Where is she?" "Safe, for the moment," Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You know, I've imagined this moment for years. What I'd say to you, how I'd make you suffer. But standing here now, looking at you, I realize words aren't enough." Marcus pulled a gun from his jacket, a chrome-plated automatic that gleamed in the emergency lighting. "This belonged to my father. He kept it in his desk drawer for 40 years, never thinking he'd actually use it. But when the creditors came, when he realized that everything he'd built was gone because of you, he found a use for it after all." John's blood went cold. "Marcus, your father's death wasn't my fault. The pharmaceutical deal was legitimate business." "Legitimate." Marcus's laugh was sharp, unhinged. "You used insider information. You knew about the FDA investigation before we did. Use that knowledge to short our stock and buy our assets when they collapsed. That's not... Don't lie to me." Marcus raised the gun, his hand trembling with rage. "My father spent his last night alive writing suicide notes, explaining to his children why he'd rather die than live with the shame of what you did to us. Do you know what that does to a family, John? Do you have any idea what it feels like to find your father's body?" John held up his hands, trying to project calm. "I'm sorry about your father, Marcus, truly, but taking your anger out on Sophie won't bring him back. No, but it will teach you what loss feels like, what helplessness feels like." Marcus gestured toward the back of the restaurant. "She's in the wine cellar, alive, unharmed, waiting for her father to save her. Just like I waited for my father to find a way out of the mess you created. I'm here. I surrendered myself just like you asked. Let her go. Oh, I will. But first, you're going to experience what my father experienced in his final moments. The knowledge that everything you love is about to be destroyed, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Marcus pulled out a cell phone and hit speed dial. Richard, send the message. In the wine cellar below, in the wine. Sophie heard footsteps on the wooden stairs. She'd been tied to a chair for nearly 18 hours, her wrists raw from struggling against rope bonds. But when she saw Richard Ashcroft descending with a gas can in his hand, she understood that her time was running out. Your father's here, Richard said conversationally as he began splashing gasoline around the small cellar. Very touching, really. Walking into certain death to save his daughter. Too bad it won't work. You're insane, Sophie whispered, her throat dry from hours of shouting. Maybe, but your father made us this way. Richard struck a match and held it up, the flame dancing in his eyes. Goodbye, Sophie Collins. Give my regards to your mother when you see her. Above them, Marcus was explaining his plan to John, with the enthusiasm of a child describing a favorite toy. I'm going to burn this place down with your daughter inside. You'll be able to hear her screaming, but you won't be able to save her, just like I couldn't save my father from the despair you caused him. John felt something break inside his chest. Not his heart, but something deeper. The careful walls he'd built around his emotions. The protective barriers that had let him function despite decades of guilt and regret. Please, he whispered, take me instead. Kill me however you want, but let Sophie live. She's innocent in all this. So was my father. The smell of gasoline began drifting up from the wine cellar, followed by the acrid scent of smoke. Marcus smiled as he saw recognition dawn in John's eyes. Too late now, John. Time to watch everything burn. But John wasn't listening anymore. He was moving, diving across the darkened restaurant toward the cellar stairs, as Marcus's gun cracked behind him. Pain exploded across his shoulder as a bullet found its mark, but he kept running. He could hear Sophie coughing in the smoke below, could see the orange glow of flames beginning to consume the wine cellar's wooden shelving. Without hesitation, John plunged down the burning stairs. Sophie's eyes widened as her father appeared through the smoke, his shirt already singed, blood streaming from his wounded shoulder. Dad! The word escaped before she could stop it. The first time she'd called him that, John reached her chair and began sawing at her bonds with a piece of broken glass, ignoring the flames that were now licking at the cellar walls. I've got you, he gasped, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. I've got you, sweetheart. The ropes finally parted, and Sophie fell into his arms. For a moment, father and daughter held each other in the burning cellar, 25 years of separation bridged by desperate love. We need to get out of here, Sophie said. But even as she spoke, they could see that the stairway was now completely engulfed in flames. John looked around the cellar, searching for another way out. There, a small window near the ceiling, barely large enough for Sophie to squeeze through. Can you make it up there? He asked, pointing to the window. What about you? John looked at his wounded shoulder, at the spreading fire, at the impossible geometry of escape. He was too large to fit through the window, too weak from blood loss to climb even if he could. But Sophie was small, athletic. She could make it. I'll be right behind you, he lied. Sophie saw the truth in his eyes. No, I'm not leaving you here. Sophie, listen to me. John gripped her hands, his voice urgent. I failed you once by leaving. Don't let me fail you again by making you stay. Go, live, become everything your mother dreamed you could be. Dad, please. I love you. The words came out in a rush. 25 years of unspoken emotion compressed into 3 simple syllables. I have always loved you. Every day since I walked away, you've been in my heart. And your mother, God, Sophie, she would be so proud of who you've become. John pulled the twin medallions from his pocket, his grandmother's and Sophie's, which he had repaired, and pressed them into her hands. Take these, remember us, remember that you were loved, always. The ceiling above them groaned ominously, and John boosted Sophie toward the window. She fought him at first, then realized that staying would mean they both died instead of just one of them. I forgive you, she sobbed as she reached the window. For everything. "I forgive you, Dad." John smiled through the pain and smoke and spreading fire. "That's all I ever wanted to hear." Sophie squeezed through the window just as the ceiling collapsed, sending burning timbers crashing down into the cellar. She landed hard on the alley pavement outside, her clothes singed and her lungs burning, but alive behind her. The golden pearl burned like a funeral pyre, taking with it the father she'd found too late and lost too soon. But in her hands, she clutched 2 silver medallions, and the knowledge that sometimes love means sacrifice, and that some bonds are stronger than time, stronger than regret, stronger even than death. 6 months later, Sophie stood in the ashes of what had once been the golden pearl, watching construction crews break ground for something entirely new. The spring Chicago wind carried the scent of fresh concrete and possibility, a stark contrast to the smoke and grief that had filled this space half a year ago. The funeral had been a media circus. John Thorne's death, along with the dramatic circumstances surrounding it, had made international headlines. "Millionaire dies saving daughter from revenge plot," the Tribune had proclaimed, a redemption narrative that felt both too simple and inadequately complex for the man Sophie had barely begun to know. Marcus Ashcroft had died in the fire as well, apparently trapped by falling debris as he tried to escape. Richard had been arrested fleeing the scene and was now serving 25 to life for kidnapping, arson, and murder. Justice, Sophie supposed, though it felt hollow without the people who mattered most there to see it. "Miss Collins," the construction foreman approached, hard hat in hand. "We're ready for the cornerstone ceremony whenever you are." Sophie nodded, clutching the folder that contained her father's final gift, plans he'd apparently been working on in secret for weeks before his death, when his lawyer had presented them to her. She'd wept for an hour straight, even in those final days, when he'd known she was in danger. John had been thinking about her future. The plans weren't for another restaurant. They were for something unprecedented, an international language and cultural center specifically designed to help displaced children connect with their heritage. The blueprints showed classrooms equipped with cutting-edge technology, a library filled with books in dozens of languages, and meeting spaces where families separated by distance or circumstance could reunite across video calls. John had called it the Bridge, a name that made Sophie think of Sister Margaret's old saying about being meant to build bridges between worlds. "We're gathered here today," Sophie began, addressing the small crowd that had assembled for the groundbreaking, to transform a place of tragedy into a place of hope. The crowd included city officials, representatives from various immigrant communities, and a handful of reporters who'd been covering Sophie's story since the night that changed everything. But the people who mattered most to Sophie were there too. Sister Margaret, now 83 but still sharp as a tack, Maria Santos from the Golden Pearl's old staff, and Carmen Rodriguez, Olivia's cousin, who'd flown in from Puerto Rico for the ceremony. "My father once told me that some of the most important things in life can't be measured in dollars," Sophie continued. "Today, we're proving that love and memory and the desire to help others can be more valuable than any fortune." She picked up the ceremonial shovel and turned the first spadeful of earth, as dirt fell away, revealing the foundation that would support the bridge. Sophie felt something shift inside her chest, not the sharp pain of grief that had been her constant companion for months, but something warmer, purpose maybe, or simply the knowledge that good could grow from tragedy if you planted it carefully enough. After the ceremony, Carmen approached with tears in her eyes. "Olivia would be so proud," she said, embracing Sophie. "Not just of what you're building, but of who you've become. I wish I could have known her better. You carry her in everything you do. The way you stand up for what's right, the way you see the best in people even when they've hurt you. That's pure Olivia." Carmen pressed a small package into Sophie's hands. "I brought you something." Inside was a photograph Sophie had never seen. Olivia holding a newborn baby, both of them bathed in hospital room sunlight. Olivia looked exhausted but radiant, her eyes full of the fierce love that Carmen had described. "She took this the day you were born," Carmen explained. "Made the nurse take it with her old camera. She said she wanted you to know that you came into this world surrounded by love, even if circumstances meant she couldn't keep you." Sophie traced her mother's face with one finger, memorizing details she'd never had the chance to see in person. "Thank you. This means everything." As the crowd dispersed and the construction crew returned to work, Sophie found herself alone at the site. She pulled out her phone and called the number she'd memorized but never dialed. "Sit, Joseph of the Blossoms." Sister Margaret speaking. "Sister, it's Sophie. I was wondering, would you like to see what we're building?" An hour later, Sister Margaret stood where the Golden Pearls wine cellar had once been, leaning heavily on her walking stick, but taking in every detail of the construction site with keen interest. "Your father was a complicated man," she said finally, "full of regret, but also full of love. I think he would approve of this. I hope so. I keep wondering if I'm making the right choices, if this is really what he would have wanted. Sophie, dear, your father spent 25 years trying to make up for one terrible decision. Don't spend your life second-guessing every choice because of his mistakes." Sister Margaret's voice carried the wisdom of someone who'd counseled countless children through trauma and uncertainty. Build something beautiful. Help other children find their way home. That's what love looks like in action. Over the following months, as the bridge took shape, Sophie threw herself into the project with single-minded determination. She studied architectural plans, interviewed potential teachers, and traveled to immigration centers across the Midwest to understand what services were most needed. The languages came in handy. She found herself translating for Somali refugees, helping Mexican families navigate social services, and working with Chinese students whose parents wanted them to maintain cultural connections. Each conversation reminded her why this work mattered. The center's first success story came before it officially opened. A 12-year-old boy named Ahmad, separated from his family during the Syrian refugee crisis, was able to video call his grandmother in Damascus using the bridge's communication center. Sophie watched through the window as Ahmad cried and laughed and spoke rapidly in Arabic, gesturing excitedly at the screen. "This is what my father died for," she whispered to herself. This moment right here. The grand opening was scheduled for December 15th, exactly 1 year after Sophie had first met John at the Golden Pearl. The irony wasn't lost on her, but it felt appropriate somehow. Full circle. The night before the opening, Sophie stood alone in the bridge's main hall, surrounded by shelves full of books in 43 different languages. Flags from around the world hung from the ceiling, and interactive displays showed real-time connections between immigrant families scattered across continents. She pulled out the twin medallions, hers and John's, which she now wore on a single chain around her neck. They caught the light from the hall's windows, throwing tiny rainbows across the walls. "I did it, Dad," she said aloud, her voice echoing in the empty space. "I built something that matters, something that helps people find their way home." A soft sound behind her made her turn. Maria Santos stood in the doorway, smiling, talking to yourself or to him. Both, I think. Sophie wiped her eyes, not embarrassed to be caught in a moment of vulnerability. Tomorrow this place will be full of children and families and voices in dozens of languages. It's what I dreamed of, but you wish he was here to see it. Yeah, I do. Maria walked over and put an arm around Sophie's shoulders. Honey, he is here, in every book on these shelves, every computer that connects families, every child who finds their heritage in this place. This whole building is his love letter to you. The next morning dawned bright and cold, with snow beginning to fall as families arrived for the bridge's opening ceremony. Sophie watched from the main entrance as children raced through the halls, their excited chatter creating a symphony of languages and cultures. A reporter approached with the inevitable question, "Miss Collins, how does it feel to honor your father's memory this way?" Sophie considered the question seriously. "I think the best way to honor someone's memory is to become the person they believed you could be. My father saw potential in me that I didn't even know existed. This place," she gestured around the bustling center, "is my way of living up to that potential." As the day progressed, Sophie found herself moving through the crowds like a bridge herself, translating between languages, connecting families with resources, helping children discover their own cultural identities. It was exactly what Sister Margaret had predicted years ago, and exactly what John had hoped for in his secret plans. Late that afternoon, as the opening celebration wound down, Sophie received an unexpected visitor. Tom Kellerman, John's former head of security, approached with a small wooden box in his hands. "Your father asked me to give you this, if anything ever happened to him," Kellerman said quietly. "I've been waiting for the right moment." Inside the box was a letter in John's handwriting, along with a key and an address Sophie didn't recognize. "My dear Sophie," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means I've finally found the courage to act like the father you deserved from the beginning. The key opens a safety deposit box that contains everything I kept of your mother's. Letters, photographs, the ring I was going to give her before I lost my nerve. They belong to you now, along with my hope that you'll forgive a foolish old man who loved you more than life itself. Build something beautiful with your life. Sweetheart, bridge worlds, connect hearts, be the light your mother and I always knew you could be. All my love, always. Dad." Sophie pressed the letter to her chest and looked around the bridge, at the children learning new languages, the families reconnecting across continents, the staff members who dedicated themselves to helping others find their way home. John Thorne had spent 25 years seeking redemption for abandoning his daughter, but standing in the center of the sanctuary they'd built together, Sophie realized that redemption had never been his to seek. Love, she understood now, wasn't about erasing past mistakes. It was about transforming them into something that could heal the world. As snow continued to fall outside and the last families departed for the evening, Sophie walked to the center's memorial wall, a simple plaque that read, "In memory of John Thorne and Olivia Martinez, who taught us that love builds bridges across any distance. Thank you," she whispered to the empty hall, to the snow falling outside, to the father and mother she carried in her heart, for everything. And in the growing darkness of the Chicago winter, the bridge glowed like a beacon, calling lost children home.